The Khe Sanh Combat Base was located in the Khe Sanh area of northwestern Quảng Trị Province, a coastal province of South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. In late January 1968, the Communist People's Army of North Vietnam orchestrated a brutal bombardment on the US base, leading the US Marines stationed there to fight back. What ensued was one of the most gruesome battles of the Vietnam War. Welcome to Wars of the World. The existence of the Khe Sanh Combat Base came about in 1962 when the US Army Special Forces built a camp with an airfield around 14 miles south of the DMZ, or the Demilitarized Zone, between North and South Vietnam. Khe Sanh served as a base for the Civilian Irregular Defense Groups, tasked with keeping watch on the People's Army of Vietnam, or the PAVN, and their infiltration along the border so that they could protect the local citizens. 4 years after this, in 1966, the US Marines were ordered to take up positions around the area. This order came from General William Westmoreland, the US commander in Vietnam, who had noticed that the base was positioned in such a way that it could, quote, serve as a patrol base blocking enemy infiltration from Lao, a base for operations to harass the enemy in Lao, an airstrip for reconnaissance to survey the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a western anchor for the defenses south of the DMZ, and an eventual jumping off point for ground operations to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. End quote. By 1966, Westmoreland had started to consider Khe Sanh as part of a larger strategy and deemed it to be an important outpost that had to be protected. In 1967, the camp was extended to serve the Marines as well as the Special Forces. Later, in the autumn of that year, the PAVN was found to be growing and strengthening in the region. Westmoreland soon began to suspect that Khe Sanh would soon become a target of the enemy as part of its larger plan to seize South Vietnam's northernmost regions. The PAVN likely hoped that an attack on the outpost would have the same results as their 1954 assault against the French colonial troops in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The Marines had tried to warn Westmoreland that remaining in Khe Sanh was a bad idea. Between the difficult terrain, rainy weather, and short supply lines, the Marines suspected that waiting for an assault from the PAVN was a death trap. Westmoreland, though, was not convinced. He hoped that, indeed, the PAVN would act in the same way that they had during the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. He hoped that they would be drawn out into the open so that the US could call upon their air support to dispatch as many troops as possible, whittling them down to a more manageable number that would force them to negotiate. As part of Westmoreland's plan, codenamed Operation Scotland, he brought in more troops so that 6,000 Marines were now stationed there. He also gathered plentiful supplies of ammunition and renovated the Khe Sanh airstrip, all in preparation for the oncoming attack. The attack eventually came on January 21, 1968. It began suddenly, but was long and grueling, with the PAVN starting a massive artillery bombardment of the outpost, destroying 90% of the base's artillery and mortar rounds within the first few days of the assault. Despite the massive risks posed to the remaining 6,000 Marines, President Lyndon B. Johnson stood behind Westmoreland's plan, and he insisted that the base be held at all costs. In the coming 77 days of battle, the Marines at Khe Sanh were put through intense weapon fire from various armaments, including mortar and rocket fire, and were also subjugated to numerous ground attacks. It wouldn't take long for the base to be cut off from ground transportation, with the US Naval Institute noting that the Marines only survived due to inventive methods to reinforce and resupply the base and its outposts by air. Classified documents today show that in response to the January 21st assault on Khe Sanh, Westmoreland considered using nuclear weapons, but this notion was later discounted due to unique terrain conditions in South Vietnam, which would have reduced the effectiveness of tactical nuclear weapons. Then US Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara wrote to the president, quote, "Because of the terrain and other conditions peculiar to our operations in South Vietnam, it is inconceivable that the use of nuclear weapons would be recommended there against either Viet Cong or North Vietnamese forces." End quote. However, as politicians, commanders, and other high-ranking military officials focused their energy and resources on the battle, they began to ignore the surrounding cities in South Vietnam, where communist plans and ideals were strengthening. On January 31st, 10 days after the assault on Khe Sanh started, around 70,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces triggered a coordinated set of attacks on around 120 South Vietnamese cities and towns. The plan for the assault, known as the Tet Offensive because it took place on the Lunar New Year, also known as Tet, was the brainchild of North Vietnamese military commander General Vo Nguyen Giap. He chose January 31st to strike because it was a day when the North and South would call a temporary truce, leaving the South vulnerable. Vo aimed to break the stalemate in the country and to drive a wedge between South Vietnam and the US, shattering their allyship and causing the US to withdraw its defense of South Vietnam. In preparation for his plan, Vo had the PAVN launch several attacks in late 1967 and early 1968, with Khe Sanh being one of the chosen targets. The idea was to bring the US's attention away from the Tet Offensive so that they wouldn't interfere with it. 13 cities were attacked by Viet Cong forces in central South Vietnam on January 30th, and the following day they continued to attack various towns and cities, government buildings, and military bases. Though media reports liken the Battle of Khe Sanh to that of Dien Bien Phu, in reality, the US and South Vietnamese forces were in a much better position than the French had been in the infamous 1954 assault. As well as having access to helicopters, which could resupply their stocks, B-52 fighter planes capable of heavy bombing were also a tremendous help in the battle. The troops at Khe Sanh forced the PAVN to deal with 100,000 tons of bombs and almost 160 shells of artillery fire. The CIA estimated that enemy replacement troops arriving at Khe Sanh averaged from 190 to 380 a day, meaning as many as 44,000 PAVN members could have been part of the battle. In early April, US Army and Marine reinforcements, along with members of the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, arrived to break up the siege. US officials had expected a much larger scale of assault from the North Vietnamese, but it never came, which led Westmoreland to order that the battle come to an end. Marine and Army generals subsequently petitioned Westmoreland to discard the base at once. However, he denied the requests and ordered that the military stay present at Khe Sanh and continue operations in the area indefinitely. In mid-April, Marines patrolling a slope of Hill 689 were ambushed and attacked by the PAVN, injuring and killing numerous troops. The Marines fought back, but eventually were forced to retreat, leaving the bodies of around 30 of their fallen. The remains will be recovered over a week later. But the problems at Khe Sanh still weren't over. The following month, PAVN forces armed with heavy artillery stopped within a mile of the base and attempted to capture it. However, they received massive pushback from the Marines stationed there and failed to secure the outpost. Despite the fact that Westmoreland had been in the wrong, with his insistence that Khe Sanh was important being incorrect, as the assault on the base had been little more than a distraction, he continued to defend his decision that Khe Sanh was an important outpost that needed to be protected. He subsequently claimed that the 77-day siege with the PAVN was a victory, and that the US had been successful in stopping North Vietnam from seizing control of the northwest corner of the South. Furthermore, he added that they had done much damage to the PAVN's forces. According to later reports, mostly books covering the siege and Westmoreland's actions, he insisted for months that the Tet Offensive was a distraction rather than the other way around, and was purportedly so intense in sticking to his plan during the siege that he threatened to resign if his wishes were not obeyed. Westmoreland was promoted to Army Chief of Staff in June of that year. His replacement, General Creighton Abrams, ordered the base to be evacuated and destroyed, but this would take several weeks, meaning that the Marines had to remain so that they could keep the PAVN at bay in the meantime. On July 5th, 1968, a Marine platoon went to retrieve the bodies of 8 fallen troops on Hill 689. Reportedly, The Marine units on 689 and Hill 881 were supposed to have been helicoptered out days earlier, but an enemy ambush had resulted in further US deaths. As the platoon arrived on the hill, however, things quickly went astray. Members of the PAVN were waiting in hidden bunkers and spider holes. The bodies lay in the center like bait, trapping the Marines. As the men tried to retrieve the bodies, some were slaughtered and others wounded. The day soon became dark, and the Marines realized that they would have to leave further bodies behind. The following day, Lieutenant Colonel Archie Van Winkle, commander of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, ordered the remainder of the group to be airlifted to Hill 689 to deal with the situation. The next night, hundreds of PAVN troops approached the Marines, calling out in English and feigning to be injured members of their own group. The ruse allowed them to get close to the US troops before launching themselves down the Marine trench lines, and while their plan overwhelmed the US troops, the Marines were able to turn the battle around, counterattacking and reclaiming their positions. Still though, the bodies remained out of reach as the PAVN and Marines hit a sort of stalemate. On July 8th, Major General Ray Davis flew to meet with Van Winkle to discuss what to do about the remains. One member of Davies' staff recalled, quote, "I remember the look on the faces of the troops. They had tried unsuccessfully to bring the bodies back, and each time they were ambushed by the MVA, who had staked out the remains. I could tell that the Marines did not want to go back out there again. It was painful to watch." End quote. The next day, however, the US managed to succeed in bringing all but 2 of the bodies back home, after they used coordinated fire from various weapons, while 2-man teams labeled as body snatcher teams, camouflaged with black paint and carrying body bags, moved to take the bodies one at a time. The mission was over in 30 minutes, and there were no further fatalities. The last Marines left the hill on July 12th. Though Westmoreland was celebrated following his time in Vietnam, the same could not be said of his peers. On March 31st, 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson announced that he was halting the majority of attacks in North Vietnam and opening peace negotiations. He also withdrew his candidacy for re-election. His approval throughout his term in office had declined, and even the public had become frustrated with the decisions he had made during the Vietnam War, with the Tet Offensive being particularly damaging to his public image, as it inflamed the US anti-war movement. After leaving politics, Johnson retired to his ranch and eventually died in 1973. The Battle of Khe Sanh is still considered controversial to this day. From its handling by Westmoreland to the reasons behind the PAVN's attack, many feel that there are questions that are still unanswered and criticisms that have been largely ignored by the government. Following the end of the 77-day siege, the Washington Star looked at the battle with a much more patriotic and positive lens, writing, quote, "To be sure, Khe Sanh will be a subject of controversy for a long time, but this much about it is indisputable. It has won a large place in the history of the Vietnam War as an inspiring example of American and Allied valor. One day, in fact, the victory over the siege may be judged a decisive turning point that finally convinced the enemy he could not win."